Who came first, Jesus or Paul? Okay. But Paul wrote first. So any Jesus that you read about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John is written by someone who has already heard the teaching of the Apostle Paul. And it has, and I say this positively, tainted their mindset. Does that make sense? So the Gospel of Mark, most scholars say the Gospel of Mark was the one that was written first in history. The argument is around 65 AD, right? Somewhere at 60, 65, somewhere in there. By then, St. Paul was probably already dead. And all of the letters that he had written authentically by his own hand were well circulated. And the evangelist Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, would be familiar with those letters, right? So for example, if I were to write my own Gospel of Jesus today, there is no way that I could write that without knowing and being saturated by Paul's thought, right? Because I've read it, I know it. It's impossible. Likewise, the Markan Jesus, along with the Matthean Jesus and the Lucan Jesus and the Johannine Jesus are all, and I say this positively, tainted, colored, fumed is a better word, by the teachings of St. Paul. Does that make sense? So again, Paul was probably dead by 55 AD. Again, these are all speculative dates, but you get the idea. He had written and was dead by 55, maybe 58. Mark's writing in 60, 65. Luke is somewhere right after 70. Some say John is around 90, and Matthew is probably the latest, 93. Whatever the actual dates, but you can see they're all later than the Apostle Paul, right? So Paul, like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah, is putting this teaching out. The Gospels come and tell that teaching of Jesus in narrative form, which is why Mark, the first of them written, begins with Jesus in his story in Galilee, coming from Galilee, right? And then Luke tells the story further. And Luke does it in 2 volumes, Luke and Acts. In the first one, Jesus is the main player. And in the second one, the Holy Spirit's the main player, right? Do you follow how that? But in both of them, Jesus in Luke carries the gospel, which is the teaching of St. Paul that Luke knew. And in Acts, the Holy Spirit is the carrier of the gospel, which is Pauline, which Luke knew. You know what I mean? So you can see how the Old Testament influences the structure of the New. But it's all that prophetic or apostolic teaching that is then retold in narrative form going forward.